And on that note, say welcome everyone to our weekly call. I'm going to share my screen just for a moment to remind us all of our agenda for today, which will be pretty straightforward as always. So as you just saw, we're at in a moment we'll sort of introduce Dan Sexton, who some of you, if you're at the IETF meeting at the start of this month, will have hopefully bumped into Dan possibly in the side meeting on this same subject, which is privacy preserving web filtering, which Dan's going to sort of talk about. And as you can see, he's CTO of the Internet Watch Foundation, which I'm sure for anyone that hasn't come across the IWF before, I'm sure he'll explain what that is as well. And that'll be the main focus of our discussion today. Time permitting, I'll touch on a couple of things that came up at the European Commission's high-level group on internet governance, which met last Thursday. And then, as always, I'll just highlight also some sort of recent developments in the news. We'll talk about sort of some of the forthcoming events, probably through into the first quarter of next calendar year, and anything else, time permitting, that anyone wants to talk about. So that's the plan for the call today. So let me first hand over then to Dan. Just check that your sound is working okay, Dan. Your vision certainly is, because I can see you.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, great.
Fine. And you should be able to sort of screen share as well, if you wish, or share your slides. You don't have to screen share. You can just share the individual bits of software if you want to.
So I had some slides which I presented at IETF, the side meeting, but I'm just going to talk through today for anyone that may have already seen the deck. So I haven't created a specific presentation, but thank you for inviting me to talk, Andrew. I'll do the intro bit first, and I'll just talk a little bit about the challenge which I presented at IETF London, and talk a little bit around some of the challenges around that and where we might go next. So IWF, for those that don't know, we're a charity based in the UK. We've been around for 25 years. We are a non-profit. We're industry funded, and our role is to find, assess, remove child sexual abuse material from the internet. And we then provide data about that material, URL lists and hash lists, keywords lists, other services to industry to help them keep their platform safe and remove the content that we've assessed at a much greater scale. So the recent IETF was an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the URL list and the effects that increasing web encryption has had on that list. So the URL list is we started providing this to BT in 2004, which they deployed using their clean feed platform, and still are deploying this using that platform. And it is and has been used by all the major ISPs in the UK, and increasingly also in other parts of the world, in Europe, Africa, Philippines, and other places are deploying this at that kind of ISP level. And by filtering companies which have come in to provide that for both ISP level and other closed environments and other places. So obviously the internet used to be plain text, and this was a very effective way of detecting known child sexual abuse content. In this case, it would be specific URL. So our analysts are always trying to get down to as close as possible to the specific image that we've assessed, rather than like blocking a whole page or blocking a whole site. So as close as possible to the specific content, with a few exceptions where we find dedicated websites which are purely hosting this material, where we might block that at a higher level, at a site or domain level. The internet is mostly HTTPS now, and that is reflected in the content that we see as well. So we're seeing a much smaller amount of HTTP on that list. There is still some, but it's definitely a smaller amount, and it is slowly getting smaller and smaller. And that means that the effectiveness of that list to remove access and to prevent people from accessing these sites is getting lower. The list is always, the intention of this list has always been about protecting the end users and making the internet a safer place. It's never been around trying to stop dedicated offenders. It's pretty easy to get around. It's not a pure sort of technical solution. It's just making the internet a safer place. If you can stop people getting to these sites, it also means not only people that stumble upon it, they get less traffic. If they get less traffic, then they often will tend to just disappear anyway, because they're after traffic after all. And if you can just reduce that thing, add a barrier, add a bit of friction, it just makes it less available, less attractive for those that would be trying to profit from it, harder for those that might want to look for it. And it just makes the whole, it's always been a very effective way of doing things. But our concern is it's getting less effective. So our analysts are still working away, finding this content, generating these links, generating these URLs. And my concern was coming into the IWF as the CTO, that their work was no longer having the impact that it used to have. We're still taking that data out there, but how effective is it now? So as HTTPS comes in, you can no longer do your packet inspection. So unless you're doing decryption, which means you can't see the URLs, and that means that a lot of the HTTPS traffic just gets a pass. If you even if you're doing DPI, you're going, well, okay, I could block the domain instead. So what about those domain level things? Well, that gets harder if you're using DOH, which is another trait, and one of the things this particular group has talked about extensively. So okay, well, we can't do DPI, we can't see the domain. What about the IP? Could we do that? Well, that's fine unless it's on a CDN, in which case you've got multiple DNS. And so, okay, well then we'll use the SNI, and then we'll be able to find out exactly if it's the host or not, and then that won't work if you're using ECH. So every little hole that's been used to deploy these filtering solutions, and not just on the IWF child sexual abuse list, but also in other forms, is getting filled up. It's getting harder and harder to do. One point of consolation is that a lot of the dedicated sites, the sites that tend to be commercial and monetized in some way and are spun up by criminals, those sites, quite a lot of them are still using HTTP. And I think you can theorize as to why they haven't gone to the efforts of encrypting those sites. But how long is that going to take? Services like Let's Encrypt have made certificates for everyone, so it's democratized SSL. How much longer before those also end up being encrypted? So even if you're hosting CSAM or malware, the encryption is no longer a bit of a barrier, no longer a barrier to getting that. So with HTTPS, DOH, ECH, Let's Encrypt, what we're seeing is that legitimate web filtering, which benefits users and makes the internet a safer place, it's getting harder to do. And what I mentioned at IETF was I see this as filtering as a victim to the efforts to prevent monitoring and surveillance. And I think there's different things. So with filtering, we're talking about you detect and you take action. In this case, you're trying to go to this site, block you going to this site. That is different from monitoring where you're going, what you're doing, and trying to exploit that. But the mechanisms are the same. And what it ends up leading to is much heavier-handed approaches like SSL decryption, which is far more intrusive than blacklisting, because you don't know where someone's going, you decrypt the whole thing, you read it, and then you decide whether you want to block it or not. And what I'm proposing is, as we sort of see this list getting less effective and all of these technologies coming in, which are only making it harder and harder to do, is what are the options? And really the question is, what are the options? What can we do to ensure that filtering is still be possible on the internet, and ensure that my lists, that our team at IWF worked so hard to create, is still an effective means of reducing access and availability of child sexual abuse material online. And the outcome for a lot of suggestions from the IETF community at the side meeting were the main output there was move it to the client. So if you don't want to do monitoring, if you want to reduce data gathering, don't do it on the wire, don't do it up on the ISP, but actually do it on the client device. And I think that's a legitimate pathway, reduces risk of monitoring and data gathering. Negatives of doing it on the client is you then end up having to put more data on every device. You put that on every Android phone or every Apple device, then you're potentially putting copies of that list everywhere. And anything you put on a client device, you assume it's going to be compromised. So there are some inherent concerns that we would have about putting that list of known child sexual abuse material and making it available everywhere on the internet, like in that case. So there's a bit of a concern there, but not necessarily a barrier. And the other option is whether this web filtering would ever be accepted as a legitimate function by an internet protocol. So much as we are building in, or people are building DOH and ECH and things, and they're looking at this and they're changing the protocols in order to prevent certain data from being monitored or extracted from that. What about applying some of the technologies we've seen in other places to web protocols so that you can match two bits of information without knowing the URL someone's going to, without knowing the blacklist you're matching against, but just doing a comparison to say they are the same and therefore take some action. There are, of course, any sort of matching, even if you're obscuring that information, creates opportunities to monitor. But I would argue that it's an imperfect world. Everything is a set of compromises, nothing more so than the internet. There's always going to be that balance between privacy and safety. And just because it's not perfect is not a reason not to do it. So IETF and beyond, what we're looking at is client side a viable place to put the lists? Could it integrate with things like safe browsing and smart screen on Edge and Chrome? But what about protocols? Do protocols have a place to say there? Is the community willing to take on these sort of challenges and look at ways of doing that matching and blocking, or matching and action, whether it is blocking, and actually make that a legitimate part of how the internet works? So I'd like the IETF list to continue to be relevant and effective. I don't want to see it disappearing and the hard work of those people disappearing and no longer being as effective as it used to be. So I'd like to see that continue. And the challenge now is to try and get some sort of engagement. Are there viable technological ways of doing that? And if that could be proved, could that be in the future? So it's a bit of a long shot, but certainly from IWF side, we're looking both at whether client or on the wire, it could be viable in the future. If I don't do anything, if we don't say anything at all, then I think the list will just become, in its current form, less and less effective. And I think make the internet a less safe place for everyone. So that's the crux of it, Andrew. And I would certainly welcome any comments both on a technical side or actually any insights into the engaging with the IETF community and protocols, and whether actually how difficult is it for protocols to be changed and accepted.
Okay, and just one clarification, which may be obvious to everybody else, to be fair, but the penny dropped for me during your side meeting, Dan, when you explained that the blocking that the list is used for, ideally, it's very transient. The list, it changes quite rapidly on a daily basis. Because ultimately, the intent is to take the sites down or take the illegal content down. So some of this will only be valid for a matter of a small number of days in the interim between the team finding it and it being taken off the server or whatever. So it's not as if in the absence of this list being working, it's not that the work that the team does fails. It just means that content will be available for more, a longer period than it should be.
It's a list of all the stuff we've tried to have taken down that haven't come down yet. But there's some stuff that goes down very quickly, and there's other stuff that could be up for quite a long time. But certainly in the past, when the internet was more visible, and I'm not saying that we should go back to those days, but when this work was more effective, just putting something on the list could have the effect of being so detrimental to traffic to that particular place that site might come down by itself, just on account that no one can get to it anymore, which is sort of the way that anti-privacy measures and stuff used to work in the past. You just make it less available for general ISPs, there's not enough traffic and it just goes away. And that sort of effect is really useful. And as well as all right, we can try and take them down, take it down and take it down and pop up here and pop up there. But we keep putting it on our list. It takes a while sometimes to get things down, but we can get things on the list pretty quickly. And it just sort of disincentivizes people hosting this sort of content if it gets censored quickly. Just for John in the chat there about this idea of filtered, blocked, censored. I mean, I think censored in itself is a very loaded term. I've never really heard censored being used in a positive way. It always tends to be associated with something negative, and I think that's really tricky, because how do you reframe that word into there is such a thing as positive censorship? And that in a phrase in itself, I think is difficult to place, because the only censorship we hear tends to be authoritarian censorship, censorship of freedom of speech, censorship of values and things. It's a negative thing. And what we are doing is we are providing a list to censor the internet. The argument is that actually maybe the internet, there are some things that are worth censoring. But I certainly have a look at the draft you mentioned there.
Be worth understanding whether there's a flag, and I don't know this, an illegal flag. If there isn't, perhaps there should be under the extended DNS errors list. If there isn't, or currently, Dan, perhaps you could work with the authors to have one added, because that wouldn't be a bad thing. Okay, and Philippe has posed a question to you in the chat. Who would push the list or lists to the client?
Well, I guess if the list was integrated into something like Google Safe Browsing or Edge Smart Screen, it would have to be Microsoft and Google respectively. It would have to be part of that service, and it would have to be. One of the questions at the IETF meeting was, is this voluntary? And actually the way the list works is, yes, fundamentally it is voluntary. Or I'd say voluntary would be opt out. Like, you shouldn't have to opt into filtering for child sexual abuse material. But if it's about protecting the end user from accessing it more so than it is stopping technically capable criminals of getting to the content. Because if they want to get to the content, there's loads of different ways of them doing that. There's loads of ways of bypassing. It's VPN, Tor, dark. There's loads of mechanisms to do this. It's just making general availability. I think it's an interesting question if you get to the point where it's filtering images and videos of child sexual abuse a voluntary thing. It's illegal, and it shouldn't be a case of having to opt in or opt out. But if it was something that someone could disable, and that meant that it was more likely for it to be adopted, I'd certainly take that, because that gives you that big availability. And if some people opt out, they opt out, and that's not the end of the world. But you're getting that most people, and just making it that much harder for people to stumble across it or share it or accidentally access it.
Let me add a couple of dumb questions to Philippe's while other people think of questions that they can either post in the chat or just raise their virtual hand using the Zoom reaction option. In terms of dumb questions, do most resolvers, let's say open resolvers, for that matter closed resolvers, ISP type resolvers, so do all the well-known resolvers typically take the IWF list, and similarly do any of the filtering services, admittedly many of which are aimed more at corporates, as Peter happens to be in my line of sight. So filters like DNS filter or similar services also, do they automatically take the IWF list, Dan?
So resolvers, no, and actually we very rarely block at that level. So it's very, very rare. So it's almost always at a very URL level, at which point the DNS resolver won't have that information. So there are exceptions for these dedicated domains, and there are some of our members will only be blocking those because they can only block those. but we don't have any. There is no blocking that I'm aware of at a resolve level. It's all going to be various ISP or filterers and filterers for closed environments, and filter suppliers for corporate environments in schools, etc.
Right, thanks. I see Suzanne has commented in the chat that RFC 8914 sets up a registry of error codes and it's first come, first served. So if there was a need to add a code such as illegal, then it appears there's a mechanism to do that. I won't pretend I've read 8914, but Suzanne's knowledge is far better than mine on that, which is not hard. Peter, you raised your virtual hand, and your physical hand, in fact. But you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I thought you'd missed me for a second then, Andrew.
I was filtering you, Peter.
Oh, very, very good. Thanks, Dan, for coming on and talking about this again. It's a really interesting and important topic, I think, especially the clarification between blocking and monitoring, because a lot of people do, conflate the two. So the suggestion came up when you presented to the IETF side meeting of a service that would be available to the filterers that's like safe safe browsing from Google. I know that IETF isn't in a position to offer it to the public, but some kind of way of like submitting a URL to a service and then getting back a yes, it is blocked or not, or it should be blocked or not. You said that IETF might be interested in doing that, or it could be something that you could do. I mean, could you tell us any more about, is this something you're going to put on the table, or? I think it would be a really good
I remember you mentioning it at the time, Peter, and yeah, I think it's an interesting one for us because this is kind of going into how IETF works and our place within industry. Is we've always traditionally been an organization which supplies data to others who provide the solution. So we provide a list to BT and they put it into clean feed, but we've not done the blocking. We don't run clean feed. We're not part of that. It's just the data that drives it. And whether it's a URL list or hash lists, they go into other people's solutions. So we've been driven a lot by what is industry doing, and they tell us what data they want, and then we start providing that data because our expertise is seeing the content, finding the content, extracting data from it. That's not to say that we couldn't look at providing solutions, and there's an element of part of the engagement that IETF is trying to persuade other people who can create solutions to create solutions. Then we can put our data into it by saying, is there an issue here? Do you want to have a look at this? But obviously, if no solution, if the industry doesn't push us for that, the other option is we actually start looking at meeting halfway and creating some solutions in itself. And when I talk about the sort of the potential technologies used in other places, it's not beyond ambition to try to apply some of that technology internally and saying, well, could we just do this? Could someone send us an encrypted URL and we'll see if we can match it against a list of our encrypted URLs and then present, just a positive, negative back. I think the issue, all that sort of stuff, is always going to be scale. So certainly when I've seen colleagues in the space present solutions, it works fine unless it's too successful, and in which case you can't deal with the traffic. So there is, but then a lot of this is one really good way of moving these conversations forward is take it past being an engineering problem by proving it works. And then you can just simply say, well, it works, why aren't you doing it? As opposed to, at the moment, we're in that theoretical of, would it work? Would it not work? Could anyone do it? So that in itself is quite a worthy reason to put some resource into it.
Cool. Thanks. I hope to hear more about it because I think it would be a really good solution. It would not have the usual scaling issues because it would just be to IETF members. And you could have pretty strict rate limiting. You could it would do away with a lot of those issues, and it would allow the ability to block without monitoring. I think if it was done with hashes, and I think it solves a lot of the problems personally. But
well, I mean, one of the sort of future technologies which I thought was interesting is this rise in privacy enhancing technology, and that's you kind of get into multi-part compute there as you do a bit and we do a bit, and then we sort of share a result, but I don't know what your users are doing and you don't know what we're doing, but it's getting into that, how many parties can you have before no one party has all the pieces. So you can't monitor because actually you only have part of the information, not all of the information. So having some sort of share we've never really sort of seen ourselves as part of that, one of the computes in there. But yeah, that might be something for us to look at.
On that point, Dan, before I come on to John's comment in the chat, I know that Tommy Pauly and somebody else, I can't remember his co-author, so Tommy plus one, presented their Red Rover paper at the recent IAB workshop. I don't know if you had a chance to even glance at that because it's not that long ago, and whether that or something like that looks like it might have sort of some relevance in this space.
Yeah, so I read the paper. It's Rich Barnes with Cisco was the other co-author. So what I liked about the Red Rover presentation is it was focused more on closed environments. So where there is an acceptance and collaboration between the sort of the end user and the filterer, like a school, for example, where you can actually say, we are doing this in this environment. And I think we talked about this around other encrypted forms of web traffic, of having some flags in there that you can expose a certain amount of information to your network, and you're just saying, like, am I in a closed environment? Yes. Therefore, and you have some acceptance of, yes, there's a Cisco something appliance here, and it's doing filtering, and therefore I'm now going to expose some information. And then if it's doing that and that's not there, and you're somewhere else, it doesn't expose the information. And I think that, like with voluntary opt-in and opt-out, our list is primarily, the big impact is getting this out onto ISPs, so then everyone in the UK is preventing from accessing this stuff. But if it works just in schools or just in corporate environments, that's still a positive, because all of this is incremental. Anywhere that it works is positive, because the other thing, again, to Peter, if you can prove you can do the engineering there, then does that mean it will work somewhere else as well? So I think another legitimate way forward for us might be to look at closed environments, so controlled environments, enterprises and schools, where you have that cooperation, and it's opt-in, so you consent by using the network, you consent to a certain amount of filtering, the appliance knows it's filtering, and then if you get the clients there to accept that they're in a controlled environment, then they can expose a bit more information. It doesn't mean you shouldn't still try and do it in a privacy preserving way, because if you're doing blacklisting, there's no need to look at non-blacklisted content. And part of that privacy preserving web filtering is only filtering on the stuff on the list, not looking at anything else, not tracking anything else. And that's one of my sort of pushes of, if you don't do it in a aware way where you're collaborating, then you end up just decrypting everything. And that's open to all sorts of intrusiveness and abuse. And that's because there's no other way other than breaking everything. So if you can have that cooperation, then it actually should be less intrusive, and particularly with CSAM, because that's not general usage. Where we've had hits in schools, it's tended to be, from my colleagues that work in that space, the hits on our list in schools tended to be from staff devices. And I suppose that's the sort of thing everyone wants to be. That's for everyone's best interest, that people who are using a school network and looking for child sexual abuse, if they work in that school, you want that. And actually, arguably, that's the case where you should be monitoring in schools, because that you've got people potentially at harm there. The wider internet is a little bit different.
Yeah. John's put a comment in the chat about using the DNS for some of this. I don't know, John, if you're in a position where you're able to unmute and expand on that, because that's an intriguing thought.
Oh, sure. This is just engineering hat discussions, and I probably shouldn't go down this rat hole too far, but there are antivirus makers do currently use the DNS to distribute hashes. So they have a slightly different methodology, and that you can be a little bit slower, meaning that you can block before launching an app and send a hash with a DNS request, and whatever the DNS reply is coming back from the vendor. I know Sophos is one that has traditionally, I've seen a lot of their traffic. They send back a reply, and based on the data in the reply, you can go to or not go to the site. So there may be some options there, but again, that implies two things. It implies client software or client logic somewhere in the client path, whether it's on the device or whether it's in an intermediate device in a trusted sphere. And then it also implies user consent. So even if the data is private, you still have to have those two prerequisites. And I think that's where a lot of people on this call are interested in it, interested in the concept, which is the user consent and who generates the lists and what's the jurisdiction and things like that. Those are the high level questions that, of course, are always interesting when talking about blocking. But consent, of course, is the biggest one, because lists tend to move from consent or opt out to mandatory very quickly. And then get used for other things. So that's some of the fears. But yeah, I would say anyway, look, engineering wise, I'd say look at some of the DNS based solutions out there. There may be some interesting methodologies already used.
Great, thanks, John. Vicky, just going back to one of the comments you made earlier, Dan said about maybe the staff, if they were getting hits, were testing the filtering. I know there are actually dummy pages, so people that want to legitimately test the filtering don't need to try and access illegal content, which would have bad consequences. They can access dummy pages which will trigger the warning, but without attempting to access real content, which is, I think, a preferred way of doing that and keeps you on the right side of the law.
Yeah, it's not possible to test our lists because you don't know what's on our lists, and anyone that's going to those websites or those lists it's different to something like if you're testing adult content, you could just go to Pornhub, which is a legal site, and you can test that in a school and see whether that works or not. The stuff on our list is not legal, and you can't test it without looking for it. And if you're looking for CSAM to test it, you're already breaking the law at that point. So the anecdotally, the few instances, and this is not widespread, but the few instances where we have had hits, it hasn't been. No, I don't think it's been accidental in those cases. But sorry, that is only anecdotal from some of our colleagues in those schools. But they're just generally the consent. The goal of the list has always been protecting the end users. So actually, consent from the end user to do that is not. I don't see that as a barrier, because it's not stopping those people that really want to engage in this crime. These things are not hard to bypass, and it's not about having a bulletproof solution there. And then within closed environments and corporate environments, people get what they sign up for. So it's a different sort of place rather than the open internet.
Yeah. And on the jurisdiction issue, I think I'm right in saying, Dan, that the IWF list is used around the world, so it's pretty widely deployed already.
It is, and actually, one of the advantages in the space we work in is it is largely objectively illegal everywhere. It's different to other content, which becomes much more subjective, and it's illegal in some places and not in others. But CSAM is largely objectively illegal everywhere in the world. So it's an easier one to sort of just separate from other types of harms and put its own box and deal with separately, because it's much less contentious actually than other harm types. Yeah.
Excellent. Right, Philippe, you've raised your hand and been patient. So do you want to unmute and join the conversation?
With pleasure. Well, provided I succeeded, I don't know, let me know if I didn't. And just on the question of jurisdiction, and conversely, for lists that are national, as you would, well, at least for those I'm familiar with, there are typically various sources of such lists. We've got agencies, for example, in France, where that might issue lists of domain names or even URLs to be blocked, where the ISPs typically merge them for us to deploy in our networks. Has there been thought given to how various sources, without making any moral judgment on whether that's appropriate or not, but how such environments where you have various sources can be accommodated in the architecture?
It's not I'm aware of. I mean, certainly when our list has been deployed at ISP level, it depends on the deployment, and I don't have full sight of the deployment because we just provide the list, and then the deployment is really up to that member. But certainly, so UK ISPs will have a dedicated splash page that you'll be redirected to if you hit something in the IWF list, and it will specifically say, you've hit the IWF list. It has details about the Lucy Faithful Stop It Now charity, which deals with which provides support to offenders and potential offenders. So it's very much this is what you've tried to do, this is where you've gone, and here you can go here to get help. So it's tailored specifically for us and for the content on our list. Now, whether there's other stuff being like copyright infringement also being blocked in the same mechanism, probably the same mechanism, because it's still the same stuff. It's still just URLs or domains. Or
technically speaking, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, so it's exactly, so it's still
with the potential exception of the redirect, but the DNS mechanism is exactly the same.
So our list is going in. Other lists may well be going in as well, and they may end up going to a different splash page. But I don't have any visibility of what other. And I know certainly the ISPs will be blocking other things, and they're probably just going in, being blocked, and then filtered out to a different splash page. So now there may be that they put some that will put in a dedicated pipeline specifically for our list and keep it away. There is some reasoning to keep them separate in that you want to minimize anyone that has access to the content. So although the URL itself isn't illegal, going to the URL is. So ideally, we wouldn't want the ISP to be seeing it. You wouldn't want the engineers to be seeing it. You wouldn't want the consultants to be seeing it. You don't want anyone to be taking this list or exposing this list. However, the way it's deployed at the moment, which is plain text, that is always going to be a risk for us. If we deployed an encrypted list, which is kind of where this potentially might move to if we've deployed an encrypted list and you're comparing against encryption, that has some privacy enhancements in addition that it stops the actual companies and engineers and other people working in there from being exposed to, so which is good for everyone. It does mean that it's harder to do broader matches. So if we want to block a specific page, that's fine. But if we want to block, and sometimes it's kind of like you want to block everything after the something, obviously doesn't work once you hash that, because there is no after the something. It's exactly specific or not. So it's the whole domain or it's the specific URL. But again, compromises, if it continues to be effective, we do it at that level, we'd have to lose the and everything after section. So yeah, I don't know too much about the exact deployment, as it will vary from filterer to ISP to as it was, and we don't always get full sight of that.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks for the good question. Peter, you got your hand raised.
Yeah. Sorry, just one other question quickly, Dan. Were you hoping to have some kind of timeline as to when there might be some outcome of all the discussions you've had? Like something that will happen by, I don't know, next quarter or next year, or? I short answer is no timeline, but I'm still actively pursuing it, and I think we're looking at the moment internally about this client side on the wire, the implications of one or the other, and how we might pursue the two. Yeah, some of the comments and stuff in the chat today about, particularly on the engineering side, like, is it viable? As you said, Peter, if there is a viable solution, if we can stand something up, that might really help with pursuing it, even if it's not a scalable one. Where's a good place to keep an eye on if we wanted to see any updates?
I honestly haven't thought about it, but perhaps I'll have a chat with Andrew later about seeing whether we might be able to feed some more of those progress back into this group at least.
Yeah, very happy to do that. And well, maybe a thought on next steps, Dan. I wonder if this is a topic that would be a good birds of a feather discussion at the next IETF meeting, perhaps. I suspect it would need a bit more meat on the bones I can say this as someone that's never actually been responsible for a birds of a feather session, but there are plenty of people on here that have. But I would have, I'll speculate and see if anyone else comments whether that might be an appropriate next step with some more substance. I don't know if anyone else agrees that that would potentially be a good thing to do, or even a barb off. Well, that might be the sort of the halfway house on that. Does anyone with more experience of the IETF than I have a view on that either way? Doesn't look like it at the moment. Or maybe if anyone perhaps either on reflection after the call or anyone watching the recording has an opinion in favour or against, that would be brilliant. I would volunteer myself, but this would be I'm going to say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed person is king is the phrase, but I'm not sure I would count as having one eye in this topic. but yes, thank you for the thought, Peter, in the chat on that. Dan, anything else that you wanted to say? I mean, should people come back to you directly if they have any thoughts on this? How would you like them to move forward?
Yeah, directly would be great if anyone has any thoughts. And so we're still really looking at how we might sort of spur some continued conversation and what would be the next steps. But yeah, if any questions or comments, I'll put my email in the chat, and people are welcome to reach out. And yeah, thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to talk, and thank you for everyone for listening.
Fantastic, thank you. Important topic. Right. Let me then just change my screen, which oddly, I was going to sort of try and share something, but oddly it didn't appear on my list of options. Let me try doing that again. All right, that's better. Okay, so something of a change of subject, to say the least. So we move seamlessly, not that that's even remotely possible, from how to deal with child sex abuse material to the last meeting of the European Commission's high-level group on internet governance, which I'll keep this relatively brief in the interests of time, but happy to perhaps chat offline. Two things of interest came up. Well, there were plenty of things of interest, but two in particular that came up on the at the meeting last Thursday morning. One was it wasn't mentioned in the main body of the meeting, so under AOB I asked that they cover an update on the DNS for EU project, which I know will be of interest to a number of people on this call. And the feedback from the Commission is that they do, I think, at least have an aspiration that they will have a contract in place by the end of this calendar year. That is still, I think, their intent, but it's not there yet, clearly, is the implication. So it's still happening, even though it's not been mentioned for a while, but I think it's now past due when an announcement would have been expected, but the plan is still that there's an announcement by the end of this calendar year. I think that's partly driven by there's a bureaucratic requirement to, in order to preserve some of the funding, that there's a need to have an announcement sooner rather than later. Which should push it. So those of you that have an interest in that, I think watch this space. We may well see something with a bit more detail on how that's going to move forward imminently. And clearly the implication was that it feels like the team are expecting that it will move forward rather than not. So that was the first thing I think was especially noteworthy. The second thing was, for a small number of internet standards, the Commission is monitoring the level of adoption across the various member states, and they have a tool in place to do that with reporting. I'll put a link to that in the chat. So you can actually have a look at that for yourselves and see whether it's of interest. But they've identified a number of different standards that they want to track the adoption of, including things like IPv6 and DNSSEC and a number of others, encrypted DNS being one of the other examples. So I think that will be of interest to others. So probably in the interest of time, I'll leave that there and just quickly highlight a small number of things from the news headlines this week. So in the order that they're listed, you'll see that the Internet Governance Forum kicks off today, in fact this morning, because it's in Ethiopian time, so it's UTC -3, if I remember rightly. So starts at 6:30 a.m. UK time, sort of 9:30 obviously local time. Might just about be manageable some of the very early sessions if you're on the West Coast US, just before going to bed. We touched on some of the topics of interest last week on the agenda, which is pretty dense agenda. I think up to 11 or 12 parallel tracks on some days. And if you're interested in the background to the IGF, Milton Muller, the Internet Governance Project, published an interesting write-up, his take on the history of the IETF and IGF, sorry, and the current direction of travel that it has, which I thought was an interesting read. You may too. More specific to DNS, Jeff Houston, published his latest thoughts on the APNIC blog on DNS centralization, which is, as always with Jeff, well worth a read and has plenty of supporting data. And sort of linked to that, there's a nice piece, but not with that URL. Apologies, I somehow got my URL scrambled. So I'll, when I put the notes on the website, I'll put the correct URL. But there's a nice piece on who controls the internet paper that was presented at the ICANN's DNS symposium a couple of weeks back. So if you're interested in that, don't click on that link. I'll send an updated link with the notes, so you have the correct URL. Also, there's now experimental support for ECH, specifically within the with the Google Chrome Canary. So details on that are now available. And then a couple of other things. Those of you involved in open source are no doubt watching the proposed Cyber Resilience Act from the European Union with interest. It does have implications for open source software developers, and NLNet Labs have put a good piece on that. And there's a few other sort of policy orientated pieces, probably closer to home for me, not least of which is the UK's online safety bill is imminently going to start moving through its parliamentary process again. I think later on this week it will sort of resume progress through the relevant processes. And then finally, nothing to do with anything DNS related, but there's just some thoughts. I can't remember the author, but it was quite interesting on Mastodon, on sort of tips and tricks, which I know some people on here have put a toe in the water with Mastodon, so may have a view on some of the tips and tricks. For those who haven't but are thinking about options in lieu of Twitter, may find that of use. I'll look to see if I can find something similar on Post, which seems to be also gathering ahead of steam as a Twitter alternative. Other than that, IGF is the last major event that I'm aware of this calendar year, but the calendar for next year, there's plenty on the agenda, certainly February, March, April. If you're planning to go to IETF 116 in Yokohama, registration is now open. More importantly, I don't leave it later than you have to book air travel. The tickets I booked rather smugly a few weeks ago have now more than doubled in price. Yeah, the sort of similar rate of inflation for air tickets has happened in the run-up to certainly the Philadelphia meeting and presumably the London meeting, although I obviously didn't need to book tickets for that. There's a whole bunch of different places where there are calls for papers or presentations. I won't sort of run through them all here, but there are plenty which are DNS specific. Perhaps two that I'll highlight. The one at the top, the Journal for Cyber Policy has got a call for papers for a special issue on DNS, which may be of interest to some people. So yeah, click on the URL to find out more about what topics they want to cover and whether you might want to submit something. And then I just highlight the one at the bottom, which again is DNS specific, the FOSDEM forum, which has got a DNS developer room call for presentations in particular. Just at the bottom of the screen, and of course in the middle there you've got OARC 40 has also got a call for presentations, which again obviously by definition will be DNS specific. In terms of things we've got coming up, a slight update to what I sent out yesterday, I think it was. Peter has kindly agreed, well, he agreed last week to cover two topics for us, but we've reversed the proposed running order of them. So we'll do the sort of the tracker or the blocker sort of element first, penciled for the 9th of January, and then later in the month we'll an update to Rule 53 on ever more imaginative uses of DNS. So both of those are in January. You'll see more topics added over the next few days to that list. And I should say, just a reminder, if anyone has anything you would particularly like to cover, do let me know. I'll happily include you on the agenda. And similarly, if you don't have anything you'd like to cover yourself, but as a topic you think would be useful to cover, then just let me know. And if you've got any suggestions for a speaker on it, that would be even better. But even if you don't, do just reach out to me if you wish. And just as we haven't quite run out of time, that sort of takes us up to the hour. So let me stop sharing my screen. We've got about 2 minutes left. So does anyone else, we're definitely on AOB, does anyone have anything else that you want to mention? Or indeed anyone that was at the HLRG meeting, anything you want to say about either the stuff I mentioned or anything you think I overlooked and should have mentioned? You can either pop it in the chat or better still raise your virtual hand and just unmute and talk about it in our remaining 60. Hi, Kathy.
Yeah. So I put out a blog. It's not DNS, but if it's of use to anyone, it lists all of the services and applications that we could find that we thought were relevant for organizations that support WebAuthn. So that's on CIsecurity.org. I would love feedback. If anything has changed and your service that you know of, now supports it, or we should add something else, that would be great to know too. We'd like to maintain it.
Fantastic. Will you put the relevant details in the chat, Kathleen, and then I'll make sure they're shared?
I'll email it to you in the interest of 1 minute and not being able to do it in that time.
Fair enough. Even better. Yeah, why not? Yes, please do. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Anyone else with anything else you'd like to mention this week? Just give a chance to see if any other hands are raised or anything else in the chat. Nope, I'm not seeing anything. Okay, in which case, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you in particular, Dan, for your input, and hopefully that will sort of trigger some people coming back to you with their sort of views, and that will evolve over the coming weeks, and we can do an update on that. have a fantastic week, everyone. Hopefully you don't get too wet. Hope the weather where you are is better than here, and we'll catch up again this time next week. So see you all then. Have a great week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew.